It is a strange thing to have your entire life reduced to a single sheet of paper. For Silas Mercer, it was an eviction notice taped to the door of his dormitory room. The university letterhead looked crisp and almost cheerful against the cheap wood veneer. Formal, non-negotiable, a deadline printed in bold black ink that left no room for negotiation, no room for mercy, and no room for a 22-year-old kid who had absolutely nowhere else to go. Graduation was over. The ceremonies were done. The caps had been thrown. The photographs had been taken. And the real world had arrived. Not with a roar, not with a welcome, but with a bureaucratic whisper that said in the politest possible language, "Get out." If you have ever stood in a doorway and felt the ground dissolve beneath your feet, if you have ever watched a clock tick down towards zero with nothing waiting on the other side, then maybe you already know how this feels. Maybe this story is for you. The hallway of the dormitory was empty, not just quiet, empty in the way that places become when every trace of life has been stripped from them. The doors hung open on both sides, revealing bare mattresses wrapped in plastic naked bulletin boards, garbage bags left behind by students who had already driven home to families who were waiting for them. The air was thick with ghosts, stale pizza, cheap beer, the faint chemical smell of cleaning solution that could not quite mask 4 years of living. Everyone was gone. Their cars had been packed days ago, their parents had come with SUVs and minivans had hugged them in the parking lot, had said things like, "We are so proud of you and let's get you home." Silas had watched them from his window on the third floor. He had watched every single one of them leave. And now the building was silent, and he was the last one standing in it, wandering the corridors, like something the university had forgotten to throw away. He sat on the edge of his stripped mattress, the plastic crinkled beneath him. The sound was obscene in the silence. He stared at the wall and tried to think, tried to plan, tried to do what every commencement speaker had told him to do. Go out there and change the world. Seize the day. The future is yours. The future. He almost laughed. He had a degree in philosophy. He had a mountain of student loan debt that pressed down on his chest like a physical weight every time he thought about it. And he had exactly $217 in his bank account. That was everything. That was the sum total of Silas Mercer at 22 years old. His parents had died when he was a teenager, a car accident on a stretch of highway outside of Pittsburgh. One phone call, one evening, and the world split in half and everything that came before became a foreign country he could never return to. The aunt who took him in afterward, his mother's sister, had done her best. But she had 3 children of her own and a husband who worked double shifts at a warehouse, and their house was small and their money was smaller. There was love there, but it was stretched thin like fabric pulled over too large a frame. When Silas left for college on a scholarship, they all knew without anyone saying it out loud that there would be no coming back. There was no childhood bedroom waiting for him, no welcoming couch, no door that would open and a voice that would say, "Come in, stay as long as you need." There was just this room, this notice, this silence. He pulled out his phone. The screen glowed a cruel blue in the dimming light. He opened the job listing app he had been refreshing obsessively for 3 months. Entry-level position requires 3 to 5 years of experience. It was a joke, a cruel systemic joke that the entire economy seemed to be playing on an entire generation, and Silas was no longer in the mood for it. He had applied for over 100 jobs. He had tailored each resume, written each cover letter with the desperate precision of a man writing ransom notes. He had gotten 2 interviews. He had gotten 0 offers. The world, it turned out, was not in desperate need of a newly minted philosopher. He closed his eyes, and there it was, the old familiar feeling, the cold dread that started at the base of his spine and climbed upward like frost spreading across glass. He had felt it before. He had felt it standing at his parents' funeral, watching the 2 caskets being lowered into the ground, while a minister he did not know said words that were supposed to mean something. He had felt it lying awake in the narrow bed at his aunt's house, listening to the sounds of a family that was not quite his. It was the feeling of being fundamentally untethered, a ship without an anchor drifting towards something sharp and final. That was when the email arrived. It did not have a flashy subject line, no exclamation marks, no urgent call to action, just 5 words in plain text. Regarding the estate of Garrett Mercer, his thumb hovered over the delete button. He received spam emails every week, predatory messages targeting the desperate. Inheritance scams, lottery wins, Nigerian princes. He had learned to recognize them by the smell of their desperation, which always mirrored his own. But Garrett Mercer, that name, he had not heard it spoken in over a decade. It was a ghost, a myth, a black hole in the family tree that everyone had agreed silently and permanently to never discuss. Garrett Mercer was his grandfather, his mother's father, the man who, according to the only story Silas had ever been told, had walked out on his grandmother and his mother when his mother was just a little girl. He had sent a few postcards from somewhere out west, and then nothing. Silence. A void where a person used to be. Silas clicked the email open. It was from a law firm in a town he had never heard of, Granite Falls, Colorado. The message was brief, formal, and so unexpected that Silas read it 3 times before the words began to assemble themselves into meaning. It stated that Garrett Mercer had passed away 3 months prior. It stated that after an extensive search, Silas had been identified as his last known living descendant. It stated that he was the sole heir to the estate. The word estate conjured images that did not belong in his life. Sprawling mansions, mahogany libraries, trust funds with more zeros than he could count. The kind of inheritance you see in movies handed to people who wear suits and sign documents with heavy pens. He almost laughed again. This had to be a scam. A cruel, elaborate fiction designed by someone who somehow knew exactly how desperate he was. But there was a name at the bottom of the email. Meredith Hargrove, attorney at law. And there was a phone number. His hands were shaking when he dialed. A calm voice answered on the second ring. Measured, professional. The voice of someone who delivered life-altering news the way other people delivered weather reports. Hargrove Law. Silas explained who he was. His voice cracked halfway through his own name. Meredith Hargrove did not sound surprised. She sounded like she had been waiting. Mr. Mercer. Silas, is it? I have been trying to reach you. The university records were a bit outdated. A pause. I am sorry to be the one to inform you of your grandfather's passing. I didn't know him. Silas stammered. The words came out too fast, offensive, as if he were apologizing for something. I thought he was gone a long time ago. There was a silence on the other end of the line, not an empty silence, a considered one. I see, she said, and in those 2 words he heard something he did not expect. Not pity, understanding. Well, she continued, his affairs were not complex. He did not have much in the way of liquid assets. In fact, he had almost nothing. But he did own a piece of property, 5 acres just outside of town. It is yours now, free and clear. The deed has been transferred. 5 acres. The words hung in the air of the empty dormitory room like something fragile. It was not a mansion. It was not a trust fund. But it was something. It was land. It was a place. It was a point on a map that belonged to him. What kind of property? Silas asked. His heart had begun to pound a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. Is there a house? Another careful pause. There was, Meredith said, a small cabin. I am told it burned down approximately 20 years ago. The hope that had flared in his chest flickered. The land itself is quite rugged, mostly rock and scrub pine. It is bordered on one side by a significant granite cliff face. It is not considered prime real estate, Mr. Mercer. The town has it assessed at next to nothing for tax purposes. Burned down, rugged, next to nothing. The hope did not die. It should have. By every rational measure, it should have gone dark. But it held a faint ember, refusing to be extinguished. There is one other thing, Meredith added. Her tone shifted slightly, dropping half a register. A complication. Of course there was. A development corporation called Summit Peak Corp has been acquiring land in that area for years. They intend to build a luxury resort and recreation complex. Your grandfather's parcel is the last private holding on that entire mountainside. They have made offers repeatedly. He always refused. They have a standing offer of $20,000 for the deed. $20,000. Silas closed his eyes. The number was so large it felt fictional. It was more money than he had ever held in his life. It was more money than he could imagine holding. It was a security deposit on an apartment, a used car, food for a year, breathing room, a chance to stop drowning. They have been persistent, Meredith continued. Your grandfather believed they were not operating in good faith. He believed they were trying to force him out. The offer is on the table, Silas. All you have to do is sign and the money is yours. She paused. Given your circumstances, which I can only guess at, it might be the most sensible option. Sensible? Yes, it was the most sensible thing in the world. Take the money, pay off a fraction of the debt, find an apartment in some city, start over. Forget the ghost of a grandfather he had never met. Forget the worthless patch of rock and pine at the edge of the Rockies. But something held him back. Something small and stubborn that he could not name. A flicker of defiance. The man had held out for decades. He had been offered money year after year, and he had refused. Every single time. Why? What had he been protecting or who? There is also a safe deposit box, Meredith said. At the local bank, the key was among his personal effects. The contents are legally yours. I do not know what is in it. He was a very private man. Or, Silas said, the word came out before he had decided to say it. I'm sorry, Tom. Or what? What is the alternative? Or you keep it, she said, simply, without decoration. It is your land. A key, a map, a choice. Silas hung up the phone and stared at the eviction notice on the door. $20,000. The words echoed in his skull, ricocheting off the walls of his empty future. It was an escape hatch, a clean break, a ticket to somewhere that was not here. But escape to where? To another anonymous apartment in another city where he knew no one. To start from a different kind of zero. He looked at everything he owned. A duffel bag of clothes, a box of books, a philosophy degree that had cost 4 years and $100,000 in debt and had so far proven useful for exactly nothing. He had nothing to lose. And somewhere in Colorado, he had 5 acres of rock and pine. He sold his textbooks the next morning to a used bookstore near campus. They gave him $62. He sold his laptop to a kid in the lobby of the student union for another 100. He took the money and walked to the bus station and bought a one-way ticket to Granite Falls, Colorado. The journey took 3 days. 3 days of diesel fumes and vinyl seats and the endless, hypnotic hum of highway beneath the wheels. He ate at greasy spoon diners at rest stops where the coffee was burnt and the waitresses called him honey without looking up from their order pads. He slept with his forehead against the cold window glass and watched America unscroll past him like a film he had never seen before. The flat, sun-baked plains of the Midwest. Endless fields of corn and wheat stretching to horizons so distant they curved. Then the slow, almost imperceptible rise. The land beginning to swell and buckle. The first foothills appearing like the shoulders of sleeping giants. And then, on the morning of the 3rd day, the Rockies. They rose out of the earth like a wall, like a declaration. Massive, snow-capped, ancient, beyond comprehension. Silas pressed his face to the glass and stared. He had never seen mountains before. Not real ones, not like these. They made everything he had ever known seem temporary and small. With every mile, the institutional gray of his university life faded. The fluorescent lights, the cramped dorm room, the hum of anxiety that had been his constant companion for 4 years. It all receded, replaced by the deep greens and cold blues of open country, by air that smelled of pine and distance and something he could not name, but that felt impossibly like the beginning of something. He arrived in Granite Falls on a crisp autumn morning. The bus hissed to a stop in front of a small general store with a wooden porch and a faded awning that looked like it had not been changed since the Eisenhower administration. The air hit him the moment he stepped down. Thin, sharp, cold enough to sting his lungs. It smelled of pine needles and stone and the clean mineral scent of snow that had not yet fallen but was coming. He could feel it. The promise of winter was in every breath. The town was smaller than anything he had imagined. A single main street, a handful of wooden storefronts with hand-painted signs, a post office, a diner, a hardware store, a church with a white steeple that caught the morning light. The whole place was nestled in a narrow valley hemmed in on every side by towering, jagged peaks that made the sky seem both vast and impossibly close. Meredith Hargrove's office was above the hardware store. The stairs creaked under his weight. She was older than her voice had suggested. Sharp, intelligent eyes set in a lined face. Gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck and had the posture of a woman who had spent her life refusing to be underestimated. She looked Silas up and down, taking in his worn-out jeans, his scuffed sneakers, the heavy duffel bag slung across one shoulder. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a quiet, thorough assessment. "Mr. Mercer," she said, gesturing to a worn leather chair across from her desk. "Silas," he said, dropping his bag. "Please." She gave a curt nod. "Silas, I have the paperwork for you, the deed, the tax assessment." She paused. "And this." She slid a thick envelope across the desk. It had the Summit Peak Corp logo embossed in the corner. Gold lettering on cream-colored stock. It looked expensive. It looked like money talking. "Their official offer, $20,000 as I said. They are eager to close. They called me twice yesterday." Silas stared at the envelope. It seemed to pulse on the desk between them, heavy with implication, heavy with the weight of a choice he was not ready to make. "Before you decide," Meredith said, leaning forward slightly, "I think you should see the land for yourself. It is about a 5-mile walk up the old logging road east of town. You cannot miss it. There is a rusted gate with the name Mercer barely legible on it." She handed him a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map. The ink was faded, the creases soft with age. "One more thing." She reached into her desk drawer and produced a small brass key, tarnished and old. "Your grandfather's safe deposit box at the local bank. This was among his personal effects." She placed it on the desk between them. "I do not know what is inside. He did not tell me. He did not tell anyone much of anything." A key, a map, a choice. His life had suddenly become a collection of mysterious objects, each one pulling him in a direction he could not yet see. He thanked her. His voice was rough. He told her he would see the land before he made any decisions. She nodded. A flicker of something crossed her face. Respect, maybe. Or maybe she thought he was a fool. It was hard to tell with Meredith Hargrove. The walk out of town was steep. The pavement ended within a quarter-mile, giving way to gravel, and the gravel gave way quickly to a deeply rutted dirt road that climbed steadily into the mountains. It was an old logging road, wide enough for a truck, but barely maintained. Weeds pushed through the ruts. Fallen branches lay across the path like barriers placed there by the mountain itself, testing whether he was serious about coming any farther. The sun was warm on his back, but the air carried the sharp edge of autumn, a reminder that this warmth was borrowed time. Winter was coming. In the Rockies, winter was not a season. It was a reckoning. The higher he climbed, the more the world opened up beneath him. The town shrank. The valley floor became a patchwork of green and brown and gold. The river that ran through it caught the light like a thread of silver. And the sky was enormous. A blue so deep and so endless that it made him dizzy to look at it. He felt small, insignificant. But for the first time, that feeling was not accompanied by dread. The world was huge, and his problems, which had felt all-encompassing inside that dormitory room, which had filled every corner of his mind and left no space for anything else, now seemed to shrink with every step. They were still there, the debt, the uncertainty, the loneliness. But up here against the scale of these mountains, they were not the only things that existed. After an hour of climbing, he saw it, a rusted gate leaning at an angle, half swallowed by overgrown bushes. A piece of wood faded and peeling wired to the top rail. He had to get close to read the letters. They were hand-painted, barely visible beneath years of weather. MEICER. He pushed the gate. It shrieked in protest, metal, grinding against metal, but it swung open. He stepped through, and for the first time in his life, Silas Mercer was standing on his own land. Meredith had not exaggerated. It was rugged. The ground was a chaotic jumble of stone and thorny undergrowth, dotted with hardy, wind-stunted pine trees that clung to the rocky earth with a grim, almost desperate determination. The property sloped steeply upward from the gate, climbing through scrub and boulder fields, until it reached at the far northern edge a sheer and monumental wall of granite. The cliff. It soared hundreds of feet into the sky. Massive, silent, ancient. It dominated everything. It was the first thing the eye went to, and it was the last thing the eye could leave. A wall of gray stone streaked with veins of white and pale rose quartz. Its surface textured with lichen and moss and the patient work of 10,000 winters. It was not just a geological feature. It was a presence. It stood over the land like a sentinel, like a monument, like the last word in an argument that had been settled a million years ago. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. Silas scrambled up the incline, his hands grabbing at roots and rocks for purchase, his shoes slipping on loose gravel. Near the base of the cliff, he found what he was looking for, the ruins of the cabin. It was not much, a blackened stone foundation maybe 20 feet by 15 choked with weeds and young saplings that had taken root in the charred soil. A few timbers lay in a heap, charred and half-rotted, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. This was where Garrett Mercer had lived. This was the home that had burned. Silas stood in the center of the foundation. He tried to imagine it. A man alone up here, decade after decade. The winters, the silence, the weight of whatever decision had brought him to this place and kept him here while the world moved on without him. Why he walked the perimeter of the 5 acres. It took him the rest of the afternoon. The land was useless for farming, too steep and too rocky. It was impossible for any conventional kind of building. On 3 sides, it bordered dense, undeveloped forest land that he assumed was now owned by Summit Peak Corp. But the 4th side, the northern boundary, was the cliff face itself. It was not merely a border. It was the entire character of the place. He put his hand flat against the stone. It was cool beneath his palm, rough and alive with texture. He could feel the lichen under his fingertips, the tiny ridges and valleys carved by centuries of rain and frost. It felt like touching something that had been here since the beginning, the bones of the world. As the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the land, a wave of despair washed over him. It came suddenly and completely like a tide. What was he doing here? He was a kid from a dorm room with a useless degree and no practical skills. He could not live here. This was not a home. It was a wilderness, a beautiful, indifferent wilderness that did not care whether he stayed or left, lived or died. $20,000. The number glowed in his mind like a neon sign. It was the only rational path. He would go back to town in the morning. He would sign the papers. He would take the money and walk away from this strange, sad inheritance, from the ghost of a man he had never known, from a piece of land that the world had already decided was worthless. But he would spend one night. That felt right. One night on the land that was his, if only for a few more hours. A vigil for a grandfather he had never met. He cleared a patch of ground inside the old foundation, the flattest spot he could find, sheltered from the wind by what remained of the stone walls. He spread his sleeping bag and his small tarp. The sky was turning orange and purple above the granite wall, and the air was growing cold fast. As he was scraping away leaves and loose stones to level his sleeping spot, his fingers struck something hard, something flat, something that was not rock, metal. His heart stuttered. He dug around it with his bare hands, his fingernails filling with dirt and grit. It was a box, an old military-style ammunition can, olive drab paint mostly gone to rust, but the steel body still solid, still sealed. It was heavy, heavier than it should have been. It took every ounce of his strength to pry the latches open. They groaned, flakes of rust fell away like dead skin. The lid resisted, then gave. Inside, protected by a sheet of oiled cloth, was a stack of leather-bound journals, a bundle of letters tied with twine, a heavy canvas bag, and beneath everything else, a single thick envelope with a name written on the front in shaky, spidery handwriting. Silas. His hands were trembling as he opened the canvas bag first. It was full of cash. Old bills neatly stacked and wrapped in paper bands. He counted it slowly, his fingers clumsy, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. It was just over $10,000. $10,000 buried in the ground. Enough to live on for months. Enough to make a real choice instead of a desperate one. Beneath the money was another object. A small, handcrafted wooden bird, carved with extraordinary precision from a single piece of dark wood. Every feather was rendered with care. The beak was slightly open, as if caught mid-song. Silas recognized it instantly. He had one just like it, tucked away in the box of keepsakes he kept from his childhood. His mother had given it to him when he was 7 years old. She had held it in her palm and said, "My father made this for me when I was a little girl." Her voice had been strange when she said it, tight, as if the words cost her something to speak. His grandfather had carved them both, one for his daughter, one for the grandson he had never held. The last thing in the box was the envelope. Silas picked it up. The paper was yellow, the edges soft. The handwriting was unsteady. The hand that had written his name had been old and tired and determined. He sat on the cold ground. The sky above was on fire, shades of orange and deep purple spreading across the heavens like a wound. The granite wall caught the last light and held it glowing faintly. The silence was total. Not a bird, not a breeze. Just Silas in the box and a dead man's voice waiting to speak. He opened the letter. It was not a single page. It was a confession, a history, a plea. It was the voice of Garrett Mercer reaching across the divide between the living and the dead. Silas, it began, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and the lawyers have found you. I am glad. I worried they would not. I worried this place and this story would die with me. I hope you will forgive an old man for the silence. It was a silence born not of indifference, but of a long and difficult fight. Silas read on. His hands shook. The words blurred and cleared as his eyes filled with tears, and he blinked them away, and they filled again. Garrett had not abandoned his family. He had left to find work in the mines out west because there were no jobs at home, and his wife was pregnant with their second child, and the bills were piling up like snow against the door. He went to Colorado. He found work in the deep shafts. He sent money home every month without fail. Then the accident, a cave-in deep underground. 2 men died. Garrett survived, but his back was broken in 3 places. The mining company, a corporate ancestor of what would eventually become Summit Peak Corp, refused to pay compensation. They blamed the workers. They blacklisted Garrett from every mine in the state. Broke, broken, unable to work, unable to provide. The shame of it ate through him like acid through metal. He bought this small plot of land with his last few dollars. 5 acres of rock and pine that nobody wanted. He intended to build a cabin to heal, to get back on his feet, and then to send for his wife and daughter, to bring them here, to start again. But the world has a way of kicking a man when he is down, the letter read. The company followed me here. They did not want this land for what it was. They wanted it for what lay beneath it and what flowed through it. The water rights, the mineral rights hidden inside that rock wall. They saw a future of luxury and profit, and I was just a stubborn, old fool standing in their way. The cabin fire was not an accident. It was arson, set in the dead of night. Garrett barely escaped with his life. He woke to smoke so thick he could not see his own hands in flames that had already consumed the roof. He crawled out through a window and lay on the cold ground and watched everything he had built turn to ash and ember. After that, he knew he could not bring his family here. It was not safe. These people, these corporations, they did not play by rules that decent men understood. If his wife and daughter were here, they would be leverage, they would be targets. So he cut the cord. He stopped writing. He stopped calling. He let them believe the worst about him because the worst was safer than the truth. He watched from a distance through public records and newspaper clippings as his daughter grew up, graduated, got married, had a son named Silas. He kept every clipping in a folder. He knew the name of every school his daughter attended. He knew the date his grandson was born. He lived for years in a small rented trailer at the edge of Granite Falls. He worked odd jobs. He saved every penny. He used what little money he had to file legal challenges against the developers, to create a paper trail of resistance, to make himself just enough of a nuisance that they could not simply bulldoze his land and pretend he had never existed. He became a ghost in his own life, all to hold this ground, all for a principle that no one else could see. This land is not valuable in the way they think, the letter continued. Its true value is not in the minerals or the water. Its value is that it is still wild, that it has not been tamed or sold or paved over. It is a place to stand your ground. I have held it for you, Silas. I could not give your mother the life she deserved. I could not be the grandfather you deserved. All I have to give you is this rock, this dirt, and a choice. Silas had to stop reading. The tears were coming freely now, hot against his cold skin, falling onto the paper and blurring the ink. He cried for the grandfather he had never known. He cried for the mother who had died believing her father had abandoned her, who had carried that wound her entire life and passed it on to her son like an inheritance of pain. He cried for the decades of lonely, grinding sacrifice. A man living in a trailer, eating canned food, filing legal documents, with hands that shook, watching from the shadows as his family lived and loved and died without him. All for this. All for 5 acres of rock and pine and a wall of granite. The $20,000 offer from Summit Peak Corp now felt like something else entirely. Not generosity, not a fair deal. It was an insult. It was blood money. It was the price tag they had put on a man's entire life. The letter concluded with a final paragraph. The handwriting was shakier here, as if the hand that held the pen had been running out of strength. The money in the box is what I saved. It is not much, but it might be enough to give you a start. You can take it and their money and go build a life somewhere. There is no shame in that. You owe me nothing. But if you have even a sliver of my stubbornness in your blood, you can use it to stay, to make a stand. The choice is yours. It has always been yours. Your loving grandfather, Garrett. The sky was dark. The stars had come out. Not the pale, washed-out stars of the city barely visible through light pollution and haze. These were the stars of the high mountains, blazing and uncountable, scattered across the black vault of the sky like diamonds flung by a careless hand. The Milky Way arched overhead, a river of light so bright it cast faint shadows on the ground. The air was cold and clean and still. The granite wall rose above him, invisible now in the darkness but present. He could feel it. A mass, a weight, a permanence. Silas sat in the ruins of his grandfather's cabin on his grandfather's when, holding a dead man's letter in hands that would not stop shaking. He was alone, completely and utterly alone, more alone than he had ever been in the dormitory, more alone than he had been at his parents' funeral, more alone than he had been lying awake in his aunt's house listening to a family that was not his. And yet, for the first time in his life, he did not feel lost. He felt found, as if he had been wandering in circles for 22 years and had finally accidentally stumbled onto the one piece of ground where he was supposed to be standing. He knew what he had to do. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a calling. He was going to stay. The next morning, Silas walked back down the logging road and into Granite Falls. He was different than he had been the day before. He was dirty. His eyes were red. His clothes were wrinkled and damp with dew. But his stride was steady, and there was something in his face that had not been there 24 hours ago. A clarity, a resolve, a line drawn in invisible ink. He climbed the creaking stairs to Meredith Hargrove's office. She looked up from her desk. She studied him the way she had the day before with those sharp, assessing eyes that missed nothing. Silas picked up the Summit Peak envelope from where it still sat on the corner of her desk. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling the promise inside it. $20,000. A new life. An easy road. He placed it back on the desk and slid it toward her. I am not selling. Meredith Hargrove looked at the envelope. She looked at Silas. And slowly a genuine smile spread across her face. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It changed her entire appearance, softening the sharp lines, revealing a warmth she kept carefully hidden beneath layers of professional composure. I had a feeling, she said, that you might say that. Meredith Hargrove sat back in her chair and folded her hands on the desk. The smile had faded, replaced by the careful, calculating expression of a woman who had practiced law in a small mountain town for 30 years and had learned that courage, while admirable, was only useful if it came with a plan. So, she said, you are staying. Summit Peak will not stop. They will assume you will fold the moment the first snow falls. They have seen it before. City people come out here with big ideas and romantic notions, and the mountain breaks them by December. What is your plan, Silas? He had spent the entire walk down from the mountain turning this over in his mind. The answer was insane. He knew it was insane. But it was the only answer he had. I'm going to build a house. Her eyebrow rose. 1 degree. Precisely controlled. A house. Silas, a building permit for a new residential structure in this county is a nightmare of paperwork, engineering, assessments, and inspections. It takes months, sometimes years. You do not have that kind of time. Winter comes early up here, and it comes hard. It is not exactly a house, he said. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper. He had torn it from the back of one of his grandfather's journals and spent the early morning hours sketching on it by the gray light of dawn using a stub of pencil he found in the ammo can. The drawing was crude but clear, a semicircular structure like a giant tin can sliced lengthwise, its flat back pressed directly against a vertical surface. He placed it on her desk. A Quonset hut. Meredith stared at the sketch. She picked it up and held it closer, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. Those corrugated steel arch buildings, Silas said. They were developed for the military, designed to be cheap, durable, and assembled quickly by unskilled labor. You can order a kit, the whole thing ships on a single truck. He leaned forward, and as he spoke, the idea that had seemed fragile and half-formed in the pre-dawn cold began to solidify, began to take on weight and shape like wet concrete setting in a mold. I anchor it to a concrete slab and build it directly against the cliff face. The granite wall becomes the back of the structure. I do not need 4 walls. I only need 3. It cuts the work and the material cost nearly in half. He paused. And it is technically not a residence. It is an agricultural or storage structure. The permit process is faster, simpler, cheaper. It is a loophole. Meredith set the sketch down. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Silas. He could see the gears turning behind her eyes, the lawyer in her running through regulations and county codes and potential challenges, weighing risks against probabilities, against the stubbornness of the young man sitting across from her. "It is audacious," she said finally. "It is borderline insane." A pause, she tapped her pen against the desk. "But it is not illegal, and it just might work." That was all Silas needed to hear. The next morning, he used a portion of his grandfather's money to order the Quonset hut kit from a supplier in Wyoming. It was a standard 30 by 40-foot model, the smallest they offered. Even at wholesale, it cost nearly $7,000. Shipping added another $800. It was a staggering sum. It was nearly everything Garrett had left him. When Silas handed the cash to the postal clerk for the money order, his hand hesitated for just a moment over the counter. This was the largest gamble of his life. If it failed, he would have nothing, not even the means to leave. The kit would take 3 weeks to arrive. 3 weeks. It sounded like a long time, but it was not. Because before a single steel panel could be raised, before a single bolt could be tightened, Silas had to prepare the site. He had to create a flat-level building pad at the base of a granite cliff on a mountainside that nature had spent 1,000,000 years making as uneven and inhospitable as possible. He bought his tools at the hardware store in town. A shovel, a pickaxe, a wheelbarrow with a slightly bent axle that the store owner sold him at a discount, a tape measure, a level, a 100-foot roll of string. He loaded everything into the wheelbarrow and pushed it up the logging road, the wheel bouncing and catching on every rut, the wooden handles biting into his palms. It was the last week of September. The aspens on the lower slopes had begun to turn their leaves, catching fire in shades of gold and amber. The mornings were cold now, cold enough to see his breath, and the afternoons were short. The sun dropped behind the western peaks earlier each day, and the shadows grew longer, and the air carried a sharpness that was less a season than a warning. He began. Every morning he woke with the sun. He crawled out of his sleeping bag, his body stiff and aching in places he had not known could ache, and he started working. The ground at the base of the cliff was a disaster. A slope of loose stone, compacted dirt, tangled roots, and buried boulders. Some of them the size of washing machines lodged deep in the earth like rotten teeth. He had to dig them out one by one. He swung the pickaxe until his shoulders burned. He shoveled until his back was a single continuous line of fire. He loaded the wheelbarrow with rock and dirt and pushed it to the edge of the cleared area and dumped it and went back and did it again. 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, sometimes more, working until the light failed and he could no longer see the ground in front of him. His hands blistered on the second day. The blisters popped on the third. By the end of the first week, the raw skin had begun to harden into calluses, thick and yellow, and rough the hands of a man who worked. Not the hands of a philosophy student, not anymore. The scale of the task was crushing. Each evening, as the sun went down and the cold crept in, Silas would stand at the edge of his work and look at what he had accomplished. A patch of level ground barely large enough to park a car. And then he would look at the area that still needed to be cleared. The boulders still buried, the roots still tangled the slope, still defiant, and despair would whisper at the edges of his mind. It told him he was a fool. It told him this was impossible. It told him to take whatever money he could scrape together and get on a bus and go back to a world that made sense, a world with sidewalks and coffee shops and mobs that paid minimum wage but at least did not require him to move a mountain with a shovel. But then he would look up at the cliff face, that massive, silent, immovable wall of granite that had stood here since before there were words to describe it. He would put his hand against the cold stone, and he would think of Garrett. An old man in a rented trailer eating canned food, filing legal papers with arthritic fingers, holding this ground year after year after year because someone had to. And Silas would pick up the shovel, and he would dig. At night, by the flickering light of a small campfire built inside the old foundation, he read his grandfather's journals. They were written in a cramped, careful hand, the entries spanning decades. Some were practical. Notes on weather patterns, soil conditions, the behavior of the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the property. Others were personal. Reflections on loneliness, on regret, on the slow erosion of hope, and the stubborn refusal to let it die completely. One entry dated 15 years before Silas was born read simply, "Another offer from the company, $8,000 this time. I told them no. The lawyer says I am a fool. Maybe I am. But this ground is mine and I will not be moved from it." Those words burned in Silas like a coal. He carried them with him through each day of labor, a private fire that the wind could not reach. The townspeople noticed him. He would walk into the general store for supplies covered in grime, his clothes stiff with dried sweat and dust, his face sunburned and gaunt. Holt Brennan, the store owner, was a big man with a belly that strained the buttons of his flannel shirt and hands like catcher's mitts. He had deep-set eyes under heavy brows in a manner that suggested he had long ago decided that most people were not worth the effort of conversation. He watched Silas the way a rancher watches a stray dog that keeps showing up at the fence line. Curious, guarded, waiting to see if it would stay or bolt. The other regulars were the same. They sat on the bench outside the diner and watched Silas load bags of concrete mix into his battered wheelbarrow. They saw the state of his hands when he counted out his bills. They said nothing. In a town like Granite Falls, you did not ask questions. You watched. You waited. You formed your judgment slowly, and once you formed it, you held it like gospel. One afternoon, 2 weeks into the work, Silas was struggling to load a stack of lumber into the wheelbarrow outside the hardware store. The boards were long and heavy, and the wheelbarrow kept tipping, and his arms were shaking with fatigue, and he was on the edge of something that was either laughter or tears, he could not tell which. Holt Brennan came out from behind the counter. He stood in the doorway for a moment, filling it with his bulk, watching Silas fight with the lumber. Then he stepped down off the porch. "You are Garrett's grandson," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement delivered in a voice like gravel rolling downhill. Silas straightened up, caught his breath. "Yes, sir. Heard you are building something up on that rock pile. Heard you refuse to sell." "That is the plan," Holt grunted. The sound carried weight. It was not dismissal. It was assessment. He grabbed the end of the lumber and lifted it with one hand, the veins in his forearms standing out like rope. Together they loaded the boards into the wheelbarrow. "Garrett was a stubborn old goat," Holt said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "But he was one of us." He looked at Silas with those deep-set eyes, and for the first time his expression softened by a fraction, by the width of a hair. But it was enough. "You need a hand with anything you ask. Do not be proud." It was a small gesture, a few pieces of lumber lifted onto a wheelbarrow. But to Silas, standing there on the sidewalk of that small mountain town, with dirt under his fingernails and blisters on his palms, it felt monumental. It was the first crack in the wall of his isolation. He was no longer just a stranger, just another outsider with a foolish idea and a limited lifespan in these mountains. He was Garrett's grandson, and in Granite Falls, that meant something. The Quonset hut kit arrived on the last day of September. It came on a flatbed truck so large it barely fit on the logging road, its mirrors snapping branches on both sides as it ground its way up the hill. The driver was a wiry man with a cynical smirk and a wad of chewing tobacco in his lower lip. He climbed down from the mum and looked at the steep, muddy track that led from the gate to the building site a quarter-mile up the slope. He spat tobacco juice onto the gravel. "You want this up there?" He hooked a thumb toward the cliff, which was visible above the tree line, catching the afternoon sun. "Good luck, kid." He unstrapped the pallet and used the truck's hydraulic lift to lower it to the ground just inside the gate. It was enormous. Dozens of curved corrugated steel panels, bundled steel struts, boxes of bolts and hardware, rolled insulation sheets of metal flashing, the entire skeleton of a building disassembled and laid out in pieces like the world's most intimidating jigsaw puzzle. The driver climbed back in his truck, turned it around with a 13-point maneuver that tore up the road and was gone. The diesel smoke drifted through the pines and dissipated, and Silas was alone with a mountain of steel and a quarter-mile of steep, rutted trail between it and his building site. For 2 days, he moved every single piece by hand, one load at a time. The wheelbarrow groaned under the weight of each panel. The trail was steep and loose, and 3 times the wheelbarrow tipped over, spilling its load into the dirt, and Silas had to wrestle the panel back into place with arms that felt like they were filled with sand instead of muscle. The struts were easier, but there were hundreds of them. The boxes of bolts were compact but dense. He lost count of his trips. He stopped counting. Counting made it worse. On the evening of the second day, as he was hauling the very last panel up the trail, his legs trembling, his vision narrowing from exhaustion, headlights appeared at the gate. He set the panel down and squinted into the glare. It was a truck. Holt Brennan's truck, a battered Ford with rust around the wheel wells and a toolbox bolted to the bed. And behind it, a second vehicle, a dusty white pickup. 2 men got out of it. Silas recognized them from town. Emmett Carlisle, the carpenter, a lean man with a weathered face and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same wood he worked with. And Clyde Dunbar, a rancher from the valley floor, broad-shouldered and bow-legged with a thick mustache and a hat that looked like it had survived more winters than Silas had been alive. They did not smile. They did not wave. They did not say hello. They just looked at the pile of steel panels stacked at the building site, looked at Silas, looked at each other. And then they started picking up panels. Nobody spoke for almost an hour. The only sounds were boots on gravel, the metallic ring of steel panels being stacked, the occasional grunt of effort. They worked in the gathering darkness, 4 men moving in a rhythm that required no coordination because the task was simple and the purpose was clear. When the last piece of material had been organized and stacked at the building site, Holt clapped Silas on the shoulder. His hand felt like a slab of granite, warm granite. "Concrete gets poured Saturday," Holt said. "I will bring the mixer. Have the forms ready." It was not a question. It was not an offer. It was a fact stated with the same certainty as the sunrise. And then they were gone. The taillights disappeared down the logging road, and the sound of their engines faded into the vast silence of the mountains, and Silas was alone again, standing in the twilight, surrounded by the components of his future home. He stood there for a long time. The warmth that spread through his chest had nothing to do with the physical labor. It was something else, something he had not felt in so long that he had forgotten its name. It was belonging. Building the forms for the concrete slab was a lesson in geometry that no classroom had ever taught him. The slab had to be perfectly level, perfectly square, and precisely positioned against the base of the cliff face. Silas spent 2 days with his tape measure, his level, and his string, laying out the 30 by 40-foot rectangle driving stakes, running lines, checking and rechecking his measurements until his brain ached as much as his body. On Saturday, as promised, Holt arrived at dawn with a portable cement mixer rattling in the bed of his truck. Emmett and Clyde were with him. They brought shovels and trowels and a screed board, and the unspoken understanding that today was going to be a long day and that nobody was leaving until the job was done. They mixed concrete in batches, the mixer churning with a sound like mechanical digestion. They poured and spread, shoveling the heavy gray slurry into the forms, working it into the corners, pushing out the air pockets. Holt showed Silas how to screed the surface, dragging the board across the top of the forms to create a level plane. Emmett followed behind with a bull float, smoothing the surface to a finish that looked almost liquid. "Stop thinking so much, kid," Emmett said at one point, taking the trowel from Silas's cramping hand. "Feel it. The concrete tells you what it needs." Silas watched his hands. They moved with the unconscious precision of decades of practice, the trowel an extension of his fingers, the concrete responding to his touch as if it were alive. There was an art to it, a craft, something that could not be learned from a book. By the end of the day, they had a perfect 30 by 40-foot slab of concrete curing at the base of the rock wall. It was gray and flat and unremarkable to look at, but it was the foundation of a house. It was the first permanent mark Silas had ever made on the earth, and it had been made with the help of men who owed him nothing. As they were packing up the light, fading their bodies, casting long shadows across the fresh concrete, Silas tried to find words adequate to what he felt. He fumbled. He stammered. The syllables came out tangled and insufficient. Holt waved a dismissive hand. He did not want gratitude. He wanted something else. Garrett would have done the same for any of us, he said. Summit Peak has been pushing people off this mountain for 20 years. Every family that sold every piece of land that disappeared into their portfolio, it was like losing a piece of who we are. It is about time somebody pushed back. He fixed Silas with a look that was part warning, part benediction. Do not let them win. The next phase was assembling the arches. The Quonset hut structure was elegant in its simplicity. Curved steel ribs bolted together and set upright on the slab forming the skeleton of the semicircular roof and walls. The panels then attached to the ribs, creating a continuous shell of corrugated steel. According to the instruction manual, which was printed on thin paper and text, so small Silas had to squint to read it, assembly was a two-person minimum job. Silas was one person. He spent a frustrating, demoralizing day trying to do it alone. He would bolt the curved panels together on the ground, creating a single arch. But the moment he tried to lift it upright, the structure would flex and buckle under its own weight, folding like a wet newspaper. He tried bracing it with rocks. He tried propping it with lumber. Each time, gravity won. The arch would sag, twist, and collapse, and Silas would be left sitting in the dirt staring at the pile of steel, the taste of failure bitter on his tongue. He was sitting there in the late afternoon, his head in his hands, when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He looked up. Emmett Carlisle's truck. The carpenter got out, looked at the collapsed arch, looked at Silas, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached into his truck bed and pulled out a wrench. Well, he said, we are burning daylight. For the next 10 days, Emmett showed up every single afternoon after he finished his own jobs in town. He never announced he was coming. He never asked if Silas wanted help. He just appeared wrench in hand and got to work. They developed a system, a language of grunts and nods and hand signals that made words unnecessary. They would assemble an arch flat on the ground, bolting the panels together with the precision that Emmett demanded. Then, using ropes looped over a temporary timber frame and the combined strength of their bodies, they would walk the arch upright and bolt it to the anchor points set in the concrete. One by one, the silver ribs of the Quonset hut rose against the gray granite of the cliff. The first arch was terrifying. It swayed and groaned and seemed certain to fall. But Emmett's hands were steady and his knots held, and when the last bolt was tightened and the arch stood on its own solid and true, Silas felt something shift inside his chest. Something that had been clenched for weeks, for months, for years began to loosen. By the 7th arch, they were fast. By the 10th, they were artists. The skeleton of the structure took shape, the steel ribs curving upward from the slab, and meeting the rock face at the rear, a row of metallic bones pressed against the ancient granite. It looked like the rib cage of some enormous creature that had lain down against the cliff to rest and never gotten up. With the arches in place, they attached the side panels. The corrugated steel slotted onto the ribs with a satisfying clang, each one adding another layer of enclosure, another degree of shelter. The structure grew, enclosed itself, became a space. The sound inside changed as the panels went on, shifting from the open echo of the mountainside to something warmer, something contained. A room, a shell, a beginning. The final step was the front wall. The kit came with a flat steel end panel, utilitarian and blank. But Silas wanted something different. He wanted a face, he wanted windows. He wanted a door that he could walk through and close behind him and know that he was inside. Home. He used the last of his grandfather's money, the last bills from the canvas bag. He bought lumber and prefabricated windows from the hardware store in town. Holt gave him a discount so steep it was essentially a gift, though neither of them acknowledged it as such. Emmett took over. The front wall was his domain, his craft, his art. He framed the wall with an expertise that bordered on casual, the hammer moving in his hand with the rhythm of a heartbeat. He showed Silas how to measure twice and cut once, how to frame a window opening so the glass would sit true, how to hang a door so it swung freely and sealed tight. He used translucent polycarbonate panels for the upper half of the front wall, letting in a flood of natural light that transformed the interior from a dark cave into something luminous and alive. When the last nail was driven, Emmett stepped back. Silas stepped back. They stood side by side in the clearing and looked at what they had built. The silver curve of the corrugated steel roof flowed from the wooden front wall upward and back, meeting the massive granite cliff face seamlessly, as if the building had grown from the rock itself. The warm honey color of the fresh lumber contrasted with the cold industrial gray of the steel. The windows caught the afternoon light and threw it back in bright rectangles. The door, painted a deep green that Emmett had chosen without explanation, stood centered and solid. It was strange. It was beautiful. It looked like nothing else in the world. It looked like it belonged here, pressed against this cliff, sheltered by this mountain, as if it had always been here and the rest of them were just catching up. "Well, kid," Emmett said. He wiped his hands on his jeans. His voice was rough, but there was something underneath the roughness that might have been pride. "You did it." He had a home. It was an empty shell with a concrete floor and no plumbing and no electricity and no furniture beyond a sleeping bag and a camp stove. But it was his. He had built it with his own two hands, with the help of men who had demanded nothing in return except that he not give up. Then the county inspector came. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 days after the front wall was completed. A white sedan with a county seal on the door, grinding up the logging road, pulling to a stop at the gate. A man got out, middle-aged, thin-lipped, clipboard in hand. His expression suggested he had been born unhappy and had spent his entire career cultivating that unhappiness into something that resembled purpose. He walked around the Quonset hut, slowly tapping on the steel walls with his knuckles peering at the bolted joints, examining the point where the structure met the cliff face. He took notes. He frowned. He frowned at the foundation. He frowned at the roof. He frowned at the sky, as if it too were in violation of some code he carried in his clipboard. Silas stood by the door and watched. His heart was hammering, but he kept his face neutral. He had prepared for this. He had known it was coming. Summit Peak had sent him. There was no doubt about that. The timing was too precise, the inspection too targeted. "Agricultural storage structure," the inspector said, looking at the permit taped to the inside of the front window. "That is correct," Silas said. The inspector looked at the sleeping bag rolled neatly in the corner. He looked at the camp stove. He looked at the small stack of books beside it. "Looks like someone is living in this agricultural storage structure." "I sleep here on occasion," Silas said. His voice was calm. "To guard my agricultural equipment." The inspector's eyes swept the interior. The agricultural equipment consisted of one shovel and one wheelbarrow leaning against the far wall beside the granite cliff face. He knew Silas was lying. Silas knew he knew. The knowledge hung between them like smoke, visible and undeniable and completely beside the point, because the structure was sound. The foundation was solid. The permit was valid. The wood stove that Silas had installed the previous week is properly vented through the steel wall with a code-compliant chimney pipe. Every bolt was tightened. Every panel was sealed. The inspector stood in the center of the Quonset hut for a long time. He looked at his clipboard. He looked at the granite wall that formed the entire back of the structure. He looked at Silas. Then he put his pen in his pocket and walked out. He got in his sedan and drove away without another word. Silas stood in the doorway and watched the white car disappear down the logging road, trailing a cloud of dust that hung in the still autumn air and slowly settled. His legs were shaking. His hands were shaking. But his face held its composure until the car was gone. Then he sat down on the concrete step he had poured in front of the door, and he put his head in his hands and he breathed. He had won. Not a war, just a skirmish, a small victory in a small battle. But it was his. He had beaten the system using its own rules, played the game on their board with their pieces, and come out ahead. And in that moment, sitting on that step with the mountain air cold on his face and the sun warm on his back, the feeling was enormous. The nights grew longer. October bled into November. Silas installed the wood-burning stove, a squat cast-iron box he found at a second-hand shop in the next town over, hauling it up the mountain in a borrowed truck that Holt lent him without being asked. The stovepipe ran up and out through a reinforced opening in the steel wall, properly flashed and sealed. When he lit the first fire, the stove ticked and popped and groaned as the metal expanded, and then a steady warmth began to radiate outward, filling the curved space of the Quonset hut, pushing the coal back to the edges. That stove became the heart of his home. He spent his evenings beside it reading his grandfather's journals by the amber light of kerosene lanterns. The journals were a roadmap, not just of Garrett's life, but of the land itself. The old man had been meticulous, obsessive even. He had spent years walking every inch of his 5 acres, cataloging, observing, recording. Plant species, animal tracks, water flow patterns, soil composition. And then Silas found the other documents, the ones from the safe deposit box that he had collected from the bank on his second day in town and had not yet fully examined. He had been too busy surviving to study them. But now, with the walls up and the stove burning and the wind howling outside, he spread them across the concrete floor and began to read. Geological survey maps, hand-drawn but precise, cross-referenced with notes in Garrett's journals, core sample results from holes the old man had drilled himself by hand over a period of years, water table measurements taken monthly recorded in columns so neat they could have been typeset. The picture assembled itself slowly the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, shapes emerging from blankness, gaining detail, gaining clarity until the full image stood revealed. The land was not worthless. Beneath the rock and the scrub pine and the thin, stubborn soil, there were veins of rare earth minerals, not a mother lode, not enough for a full-scale mining operation, but present, documented, real. And the water. The granite cliff face was not just a wall of stone, it was a filter. Snowmelt from the peaks above percolated down through thousands of feet of fractured granite, and by the time it emerged in the springs that dotted the lower portion of the property, it was among the purest natural water in the state. Garrett had tested it. He had sent samples to a lab. The results were in the safe deposit box printed on university letterhead confirming mineral content and purity levels that exceeded every commercial standard. Summit Peak Corporation did not want this land for a resort. They wanted the water. They wanted to bottle it and sell it. They wanted to build a plant and a pipeline and a brand, and they wanted to do it on ground that they had valued at $20,000. Ground that contained a resource worth exponentially more, hundreds of times more, perhaps thousands. $20,000. The number that had once seemed like a fortune now revealed itself for what it truly was. A theft dressed up as generosity. A mugging performed with a handshake and a smile. Garrett Mercer had not been a stubborn old fool clinging to worthless land out of spite. He had known. He had known exactly what lay beneath his feet and exactly what they were trying to take from him. And he had held his ground. Not because he wanted to exploit those resources himself, but because he understood with the moral clarity of a man who had been crushed by corporate machinery and had rebuilt himself from the wreckage that some things should not be sold. Some things should be protected. Some ground should be held simply because holding it was the right thing to do. Silas sat on the floor of his Quonset hut, surrounded by maps and journals and lab results, the fire crackling in the stove, the wind pressing against the steel walls, and he understood his grandfather for the first time. Not as a ghost, not as a myth, not as the villain of a family story, but as a man. A flawed, stubborn, heartbroken man who had sacrificed everything, including his own family's love, to keep one small piece of the earth from being devoured by greed. Winter arrived in earnest, not gradually, not politely, but with the sudden, overwhelming force of a door slamming shut. One morning in late November, Silas woke to a world that had been erased overnight. Snow covered everything. Deep, heavy, silent snow that muffled every sound and transformed the landscape into something alien and absolute. The logging road vanished. The gate vanished. The trees bowed under the weight of it, their branches drooping like the arms of exhausted men. The cold was a living thing. It pressed against the steel walls of the Quonset hut with physical force. It found every gap, every seam, every imperfection. The concrete floor was ice. The steel walls radiated cold inward like a reverse furnace. Without the wood stove burning constantly, the interior temperature would have plummeted below freezing within hours. Silas learned to keep the fire going through the night, banking it with green wood, before he slept, waking in the small hours to add fuel when the temperature inside dropped low enough to make his breath visible. He learned to stack his firewood in a covered lean-to he built against the outside of the Quonset wall. He learned that cutting and splitting wood was not a chore, but a survival practice, as essential as eating, as constant as breathing. The days were short. The sun rose late and set early, barely clearing the peaks before it began its descent. The hours of daylight were gray and thin, filtered through heavy clouds that seemed to press down on the valley like a lid. The hours of darkness were long and deep and filled with sounds: the groan of trees under snow, the crack of branches breaking, the distant lonesome howl of coyotes running along the ridgeline. But inside the Quonset hut, pressed against the ancient granite wall, Silas was warm. He was alive, and he was at peace in a way he had never experienced before. The rear wall of his home, the cliff face itself, was the most extraordinary feature. He had left it entirely exposed, the raw, textured surface of granite forming the interior back wall of his living space. In the morning, when the sun rose high enough to send light through the polycarbonate panels on the front wall, that light would travel across the interior and strike the granite, and the rock would come alive. The crystals embedded in the stone quartz and feldspar and mica would catch the light and scatter it in 1,000 tiny sparks. The wall would shimmer and glow, a constellation trapped in stone. It was like living inside a geode, like sleeping in the palm of the mountain itself. Meredith called once a month. The reception on his prepaid phone was unreliable, the signal bouncing off the peaks and arriving in fragments, but her voice always came through. "Just checking in," she would say, her tone carefully neutral. "Summit Peak has been quiet, too quiet. They are waiting for you to break." "I am not going to break," Silas would tell her, and his voice, which had once cracked when he said his own name on the phone, was steady now. It was the voice of a man who had poured concrete and raised steel and cut wood and survived the cold and found in the silence of a winter mountain something he had been searching for his entire life without knowing he was searching for it. He read. He read voraciously, the way a man dying of thirst drinks water. His grandfather's journals, first cover to cover twice, then the books he had brought in his duffel bag: Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, Thoreau. The philosophy that had seemed abstract and irrelevant in a lecture hall now rang with a truth that shook him. These were not dead ideas written by dead men. They were instructions for living, blueprints for meaning. He began to think about the future, not with dread the way he had in the dormitory, not as a threat bearing down on him, but as a space, an open space, a blank page. He thought about environmental ethics, about sustainability, about land trusts and conservation easements and the moral obligation of stewardship. He thought about his grandfather's geological surveys about the water and the minerals, about the difference between exploitation and cultivation. He thought about what it would mean to build something on this land that honored what Garrett had fought for. Not a wall against the world, but a bridge, a model, a proof of concept that land could be valued for what it was, not just for what could be extracted from it. His philosophy degree, that expensive, impractical piece of paper that had seemed like the punchline to a joke about wasted youth, began to reveal its purpose. Not as a credential, not as a ticket to a career, but as a lens, a way of seeing, a framework for the questions that mattered. What do we owe to the land that sustains us? What do we owe to the people who came before us? What do we owe to the people who will come after? Outside, the winter howled. The snow piled deeper. The temperature dropped so far below zero that the numbers lost meaning and became merely a measure of how serious the world was about testing him. Inside, Silas Mercer sat beside his stove in the home he had built against a rock wall, and he planned. Not an escape, not a defense, but a future. Spring did not arrive in the mountains the way it arrived in the lowlands. There was no gentle thaw, no gradual softening, no polite transition from one season to the next. Spring in the Rockies was a war. Winter fought for every inch of ground, and the warm air coming up from the south had to earn every degree. The snow did not melt. It surrendered grudgingly in patches and stages, retreating up the slopes like a defeated army, falling back to higher ground. Silas noticed the first signs in late March, a sound he had not heard in months: water, dripping from the eaves of the Quonset hut, running in thin rivulets down the face of the granite cliff, pooling in the depressions in the rock where ice had held dominion since November. The creek along the eastern boundary of the property, which had been frozen solid and silent for 4 months, began to murmur. Faintly at first, then louder. Then with a full-throated rush, as the snow melt from the peaks above came pouring down through the fractured rock and ancient channels and found its voice again. The world was waking up, and so was Silas. He stood in the doorway of his home on a morning in early April and looked out at a landscape that had been transformed. The snow still clung to the higher elevations, a ragged white line across the peaks like the hem of a torn garment. But below that line, the mountain was coming alive. The scrub pine, which had spent the winter hunched and gray beneath the weight of snow, was straightening its needles, darkening from the pale sage of dormancy to a deep, defiant green. Wildflowers were pushing through the thin soil in clusters of yellow and purple and white, impossibly delicate against the rough granite. A pair of red-tailed hawks circled above the cliff face, riding thermals that rose from the warming rock, their cries sharp and clean in the morning air. He was not the same person who had arrived here in September. That boy, the one who had stepped off the bus with a duffel bag and $200 and a head full of uncertainty, was gone. Not dead. Transformed. The winter had done what winters do. It had stripped everything back to the essential. It had removed every comfort, every distraction, every buffer between the self and the raw fact of existence. And what remained, what had survived the cold and the dark and the silence, was something harder and cleaner and more honest than anything Silas had ever known. His body had changed. The soft indoor flesh of a college student had been replaced by something leaner and more durable. His hands were calloused and strong. His shoulders had broadened from months of cutting and hauling wood. He moved differently now, with the economy and awareness of someone who lived close to the ground, who paid attention to weather and terrain and the angle of the sun, because his survival depended on it. But the deeper change was internal. The anxiety that had been his constant companion for years, that humming, buzzing static of worry that had filled every quiet moment, was gone. Not suppressed, not managed. Gone, replaced by something he could only describe as presence. He was here, he was in this place, on this ground, in this body, in this moment. And that was enough. He had learned the rhythms of the wilderness the way a musician learns a new instrument. Slowly at first, with many mistakes, and then with increasing fluency, until the music became natural, became instinct. He could identify the tracks of deer and fox and elk in the snow. He knew which birds returned first in spring and which trees budded earliest. He knew the language of the wind, the different sounds it made as it moved through the pines, the high whistle that meant a storm was coming, the low steady push that meant fair weather, the sudden silence that meant something large was moving through the forest nearby. The solitude that had terrified him in October had become his closest companion. It was not loneliness. Loneliness was the absence of connection. This was something different. This was the presence of everything else. The mountain, the sky, the stone, the water, the slow, patient pulse of a world that did not need him, but had made room for him anyway. He was not just surviving anymore. He was living. In the first weeks of spring, Silas turned his attention to the practical work of making his home more than a shelter. He built a kitchen counter along the interior sidewall using lumber he had dried in the Quonset over the winter. It was rough but functional. He ran a pipe from the nearest spring using a simple hand pump he had ordered from a catalog, and for the first time he had running water inside the structure. Cold water only gravity fed through 50 feet of PVC pipe, but it came out of the tap clear and sweet, and tasting of minerals and stone. And the first time he filled a glass from his own tap in his own home, he stood there and drank it slowly and thought of his grandfather testing this same water, recording its purity in his careful handwriting, knowing what it was worth and choosing to protect it rather than sell it. He built shelves. He built a simple table and a chair. He hung a kerosene lantern from the center arch and another beside his bed, which was now an actual bed, a second-hand frame and mattress that Clyde Dunbar had delivered one afternoon without explanation, dropping it off at the gate with a nod and driving away before Silas could form the words to thank him. The Quonset hut was becoming a home in the truest sense. Not a showplace, not a statement, a home. A place where a person lived and worked and thought and slept and woke and started again. The corrugated steel walls, which had seemed industrial and cold in October, had taken on a patina. The wood of the front wall had begun to weather, darkening to a warm silver gray that matched the stone. The interior smelled of wood smoke and pine resin, and the faint mineral tang of the granite wall which dominated the rear of the space like a mural painted by geology itself. He spent his mornings working outside, maintaining the property clearing brush, improving the trail from the gate. He spent his afternoons studying. His grandfather's geological surveys spread across the table, cross-referenced, with his journals annotated with Silas's own notes in the margins. The picture that had begun to form during the winter was now fully developed, sharp and undeniable. The land was valuable, not in the crude extractive way that Summit Peak understood value, but genuinely substantively valuable. The water alone was an asset of extraordinary quality. The rare earth minerals, while not present in quantities that would justify industrial mining, were significant enough to be scientifically interesting. And the land itself, the ecosystem it supported, the watershed, it protected the geological record preserved in that cliff, because all of it had a value that transcended dollars. It had ecological value, educational value, the kind of value that could sustain a community rather than exploit one. Silas began to formulate a plan. It grew slowly, the way his home had grown, one piece at a time, each element connected to the last. A land trust, a conservation foundation, a small-scale, sustainable water operation, not a bottling plant, not a commercial enterprise, but a community resource. Something that used the land gently and gave back more than it took. His philosophy degree, that expensive joke, that 4-year exercise in impracticality, turned out to be the one thing he needed most. Not because it taught him facts, but because it taught him how to think, how to construct an argument, how to examine a problem from multiple angles, how to articulate a vision in terms that other people could understand and support. Environmental ethics was not an abstraction anymore. It was the framework for everything he wanted to build. He wrote to universities. He contacted conservation organizations. He read everything he could find about land trusts and easements and the legal structures that could protect a piece of ground in perpetuity. The responses were slow, but they came. A professor at Colorado State who studied mountain watersheds expressed interest in the geological surveys. A nonprofit that worked on conservation easements in the Rockies sent him a packet of information and a letter encouraging him to apply for assistance. For the first time, the future was not an empty space. It was filling up with possibility. And then on a warm afternoon in late May, a black SUV appeared on the logging road. Silas was outside splitting wood. He heard the engine before he saw the vehicle. It was a different sound from the trucks and pickups he had grown accustomed to. Smoother, more expensive. The sound of money moving through the world with the quiet confidence that money always carries. The SUV stopped at the gate. A man got out. He was tall, fit-tanned, the color of someone who spent his weekends on a golf course in Scottsdale. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than everything Silas owned combined. His shoes were Italian leather, absurdly out of place on the muddy gravel of the logging road. Sunglasses obscured his eyes. His hair was silver at the temples and swept back with a precision that suggested a barber who charged by the minute. Mr. Delaney. Silas had never met him before, but he knew who he was. Meredith had mentioned the name. The regional director for Summit Peak Corporation. The man who closed deals. The man they sent when the standard offers failed and a more personal touch was required. Delaney walked through the gate without waiting for an invitation. He looked around the property with the practiced eye of a man who assessed real estate the way a butcher assessed livestock. His gaze moved from the Quonset hut to the cliff face to the surrounding timber, calculating, estimating, assigning dollar values to everything his eyes touched. He did not see beauty. He did not see history. He saw square footage and resource potential and return on investment. He stopped about 10 feet from where Silas stood, the axe still in his hand, a pile of split wood at his feet. Delaney removed his sunglasses. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, the eyes of a man who had learned to smile without any of it reaching above his cheekbones. Silas Mercer, he said. The name came out smooth and practiced as if he had rehearsed it in the car. Mr. Delaney. A flicker of surprise crossed Delaney's face. He had not expected to be recognized. He recovered quickly, replacing the surprise with a broader version of that empty smile. So you know who I am? Good. That saves us time. I am not going to insult your intelligence with small talk. You have built something impressive here. He gestured toward the Quonset hut with a casual sweep of his hand. Honestly, I admire the grit. You have outlasted 3 previous owners on adjacent parcels. Nobody expected you to make it through the winter. He paused, letting that settle, letting Silas understand that he had been watched, assessed, discussed in boardrooms by men in suits identical to the one Delaney was wearing. But let us be realistic, Delaney continued. His voice shifted, dropping into a register that was meant to sound confidential, conspiratorial, as if he and Silas were on the same side and the only thing standing between them and mutual benefit was a piece of paper. You are living in a steel shed on a rock pile. You have no electricity, no phone line, no septic system. The county will catch up with your little agricultural loophole eventually, and when they do, you will be back where you started. Worse than where you started because you will have spent a year of your life on a hill with nothing to show for it. He reached into the interior pocket of his suit jacket and produced an envelope. Cream-colored, heavy stock. The Summit Peak Corp logo embossed in gold. $50,000, Delaney said. He held the envelope the way a fisherman holds a lure casually between two fingers, letting it catch the light. Clean deal. No strings. You sign the deed over to us, and by tomorrow morning you are sitting in a coffee shop in Denver with more money in your account than most people your age have ever seen. You could go back to school, get a master's degree, start a real career, buy a real home. He extended the envelope towards Silas. Take it, kid. Go back to the city, buy a condo. This little fantasy of yours is over. The words hung in the mountain air. The breeze moved through the pines and carried them away, but the condescension lingered a residue that clung to everything it touched. Silas looked at the envelope. He looked at Delaney's hand, manicured and smooth, the hand of a man who had never swung a pickaxe or poured concrete or split wood in the dark with frozen fingers. He looked at the Quonset hut behind him, the silver arch of its roof meeting the granite cliff, the green door he had hung with Emmett, the windows catching the afternoon sun. He looked at the cliff face rising above everything ancient and indifferent and permanent. He thought of his grandfather, an old man in a rented trailer eating canned food saying no, year after year after year. No, no, no. Not because he was stubborn, not because he was crazy, but because he understood something that men like Delaney would never understand. That some things are not for sale. That the value of a place is not measured by what someone is willing to pay for it, but by what someone is willing to endure to keep it. Silas set the axe down. He wiped his hands on his jeans. He looked Delaney directly in the eyes. This land is not for sale. 5 words, spoken quietly, without anger, without defiance, without any of the theatrical determination that Delaney had probably expected. Just a statement of fact delivered with the calm certainty of a man standing on ground that he had earned. Delaney's smile held for a moment, then it slipped. Just a fraction, a crack in the polished surface, because he saw something in Silas's eyes that he had not anticipated. He had expected fear. He had expected wavering. He had expected the desperate calculus of a young man weighing comfort against principle and choosing comfort the way they always did, the way everyone eventually did. Instead, he saw stillness, the absolute unshakable stillness of someone who was home, not playing at being home, not performing homesteading for an audience. Home. The real thing, the kind that does not negotiate. Delaney put the envelope back in his pocket. His jaw tightened. The mask of corporate warmth was gone now, replaced by something colder and more honest. You are making a mistake, he said. The smoothness was gone from his voice. A winter in a tin can does not make you a mountain man. You have no idea what you are up against. I appreciate you coming all this way, Silas said. The road is tricky on the way down. Watch the ruts. Delaney stared at him for 3 long seconds. Then he turned, walked back to his SUV, got in and closed the door. The engine started with a purr. The tires bit into the gravel, and the black vehicle disappeared down the logging road, trailing a plume of dust that hung in the still air and slowly settled on the wildflowers growing along the verge. Silas watched until the dust was gone. Then he picked up his axe and went back to splitting wood. But he knew it was not over. Men like Delaney did not accept rejection. They recalibrated. They recalculated. They found other angles of approach, other forms of pressure. The $50,000 was not the end of the conversation. It was the end of the polite conversation. The first sign came a week later. Silas walked down to the gate one morning and found it torn from its hinges. The old rusted gate that had borne his grandfather's name, the first thing he had touched when he arrived on this land, was lying in the dirt, the wooden name plaque cracked in half. Tire tracks led up the logging road and back down again. Someone had been here in the night. He repaired the gate himself. It took a full day. He rehung it on new hinges and welded the broken name plaque back together with a soldering iron he borrowed from Holt's hardware store. The letters MERCER were scarred now, a visible seam running through the middle of the name, but they held together. Sometimes scars made things stronger. 3 days later, the pipe running from the spring was cut. A clean cut made with a hacksaw at a point where the pipe crossed a shallow ravine 30 yards from the Quonset hut. Sabotage. Deliberate and calculated. Not enough to constitute a criminal complaint. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to make life harder. Just enough to send a message. Silas fixed the pipe. He did not call the sheriff. He did not call Meredith. He did not panic. He simply went to the hardware store, bought a coupling and a length of replacement pipe, hiked up to the break and repaired it. His hands were steady the entire time. But the next time he went into town for supplies, he mentioned it to Holt. Not as a complaint, not as an appeal for help, just a fact mentioned in passing the way you might mention the weather. "Someone cut my water line," he said, setting a bag of rice on the counter. "Clean cut, hacksaw." Holt's face did not change. His expression remained as it always was, impassive and watchful. But something shifted behind his eyes. A hardening. A decision being made in some deep private chamber of a man who had lived in this valley his entire life and had watched for 20 years as Summit Peak Corporation had quietly and systematically dismantled everything he loved about it. "That's so," Holt said. "That is so." Holt rang up the rice. He put it in a bag. He looked at Silas over the counter. "I will mention it around," he said. That was all. 3 words spoken in a low rumble that carried no drama and no emphasis. But Silas had lived in Granite Falls long enough now to understand what those words meant. In a town this size, information did not travel through newspapers or social media. It traveled through conversations at the diner, in the hardware store, in the post office. It traveled through the quiet, invisible network of people who had known each other for decades and who communicated in a language of understatement that outsiders could not decode. Holt mentioned it around, and the valley responded. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way everything happened in Granite Falls. Slowly, quietly, without announcement or fanfare. The first sign was Clyde Dunbar's truck parked at the gate when Silas came back from town one afternoon. Clyde was inside the property, fixing a stretch of fence along the southern boundary that Silas had not even realized was broken. He nodded when Silas arrived. He did not explain why he was there. He finished the fence, loaded his tools, and drove away. The next day, a woman Silas had seen at the general store, but never spoken to, appeared at the gate with a box of canned goods and a loaf of homemade bread wrapped in a clean cloth. She set them on the gate post and left before Silas could reach her. The day after that, Emmett Carlisle's truck came up the road. Emmett got out, walked the perimeter of the property in silence, checking the water line, inspecting the gate, examining the ground for tire tracks. He found a spot near the eastern boundary where the undergrowth had been trampled, recently flattened by boots that were not Silas's. He stood there for a long time looking at the tracks, his face unreadable. Then he went to his truck, pulled out a folding camp chair, and set it up at the gate. "What are you doing?" Silas asked. "Sitting, sir," Emmett said. He sat there until dark. Then he drove home. The next evening, it was Clyde at the gate. The evening after that, Holt. And then other people. People Silas had barely spoken to. The woman from the post office, the man who ran the diner, a retired school teacher who lived in a cabin at the edge of town, an elderly couple who raised goats in the valley and who Silas learned later had sold their own land to Summit Peak a decade ago under pressure they had never spoken about publicly and had regretted it every day since. They did not organize. They did not hold meetings. They did not make speeches or carry signs. They simply showed up. One person at a time, one evening at a time. They parked at the gate or walked up the logging road and sat in the folding chairs or on the tailgates of their trucks. And they stayed until dark, and then they went home, and the next evening someone else came. It was not a protest. It was a presence, the quiet, immovable presence of a community that had decided without votes or declarations that enough was enough. The sabotage stopped. The tire tracks in the night stopped. The pressure stopped. Not with a dramatic confrontation, not with a legal victory, not with a courtroom scene or a corporate surrender. It stopped the way a river stops pushing against a dam when the dam proves stronger than the current. It just stopped. Summit Peak Corp did not send another representative up the logging road. They did not call Meredith Hargrove with a new offer. They did not file complaints with the county or send inspectors to find violations. They simply went quiet. And this time the quiet was not the quiet of a predator waiting. It was the quiet of a predator that had found easier prey elsewhere, that had assessed the cost of this particular fight and concluded in the cold arithmetic of corporate strategy that the return was no longer worth the investment. Not because the land had become less valuable, but because the land was no longer defended by one stubborn kid in a steel shed. It was defended by a town. And towns, unlike individuals, do not fold when the first snow falls. Meredith called in June. Her voice carried something new, something Silas had never heard in it before, lightness. They withdrew, she said. The standing offer, formally withdrawn, no new offer submitted, no further communication. Silas was standing outside the Quonset hut, the phone pressed to his ear, looking out over the valley. The evening light was golden and warm, painting the peaks in shades of amber and rose. A hawk circled above the cliff face, riding the last thermal of the day. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means they are done, for now at least. Perhaps for good. They have other parcels, other projects, and your grandfather's land has become, shall we say, more trouble than they anticipated." She paused. "You did something remarkable, Silas. Not many people can say they stared down a corporation and won." "I did not do it alone." "No," she agreed, "you did not, and that, I think, is the point." Summer came to the mountains in full force. The wildflowers exploded across the slopes in carpets of color so vivid they looked artificial. The creek ran fast and cold and clear. The pines filled the air with a resin scent so thick it was almost visible. And the granite cliff face, Silas's silent partner, his immovable ally, stood as it had always stood, catching the light at dawn and holding it warm and glowing until the last rays of evening faded behind the western peaks. Silas filed the paperwork for the Garrett Mercer Land Trust on a Tuesday morning in July. Meredith helped him with the legal language, her pen moving across the documents with the precise, unhurried strokes of a woman who understood that some pieces of paper were worth more than the trees they were printed on. The trust would hold the 5 acres in perpetuity. It would protect the water rights, the mineral rights, and the ecological integrity of the land. It would allow for small-scale, sustainable use of the natural resources, the spring water, the timber, the educational potential of the geological formations, but it would prohibit development, extraction, or sale. It was not a business, it was a covenant, a promise made to the land itself and to the man who had given his life to protect it. Holt Brennan signed as the first board member. Emmett Carlisle signed as the second. Clyde Dunbar signed as the third. They gathered in Meredith's office above the hardware store, 4 men and 1 woman in a small room, with creaking floors and afternoon light slanting through dusty windows, and they signed their names to a document that said in legal language that obscured but could not diminish its simple truth: this ground will be held. This ground will not be sold. This ground will endure. The professor from Colorado State came in August. She spent 3 days on the property, taking water samples, examining the cliff face, exclaiming over the geological surveys that Garrett had compiled with such painstaking care. She told Silas that his grandfather's data was remarkably thorough, that the water quality was exceptional, that the rare earth mineral deposits were scientifically significant, that the property had potential as a field research site and an educational resource. "Your grandfather was not a geologist," she said, shaking her head in amazement as she leafed through his journals. "But he did the work of one. He did it alone by hand over decades. This is extraordinary." Silas nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. On a cool evening in late September, exactly 1 year after he had arrived in Granite Falls with a duffel bag and $200 and a name he had been taught to despise, Silas sat on the concrete step in front of his green door and watched the sun go down. The light moved across the valley in waves of gold and shadow. The aspens on the lower slopes had begun to turn again, the first hints of amber and yellow appearing in the canopy like sparks. The air smelled of pine and cold stone in the sweet, earthy decay of fallen leaves. 1 year. He thought about the boy who had stepped off that bus, the one with the eviction notice and the empty bank account and the degree that nobody wanted. He thought about the fear that had lived in that boy's chest like a second heartbeat, constant and relentless and suffocating. He thought about the dormitory room, the stripped mattress, the cruel blue light of a phone screen displaying job listings that required experience he did not have for positions that did not exist in a world that had no place for him. That boy was still here. He had not been replaced. He had been built upon, layer by layer, callus by callus. Like the concrete that Holt had taught him to pour, like the steel arches that Emmett had taught him to raise, like the wood that he had learned to split and stack and burn. The foundation was the same, but the structure that stood on it now was something that boy could never have imagined. He went inside. The stove was burning low, the embers casting a warm orange glow across the curved steel ceiling. The granite wall shimmered faintly in the firelight, its crystals catching and holding the tiny flames. His grandfather's journals lined the shelf he had built. The carved wooden bird sat on the windowsill, its beak open mid-song facing out toward the valley. Silas took a new journal from the shelf. He had bought it in town the week before, a simple leather-bound notebook similar in size and style to his grandfather's. He opened it to the first page. The paper was blank and clean and waiting. He picked up a pen and he began to write. The most important thing I built was not the house. He paused. He looked at the granite wall. He looked at the wooden bird on the windowsill. He looked at the green door closed against the evening chill, solid and true. It was not the steel and the concrete and the wood, though those kept me alive through a winter that tried its best to kill me. It was not the foundation, though, that held everything up. It was not even the plan, though the plan gave me a direction when I had none. The most important thing I built was the connection. Connection to a grandfather I never met, whose voice reached me through a letter buried in the ground, and whose stubbornness turned out to be the most valuable inheritance a man can leave. Connection to a community that did not owe me anything and gave me everything. Connection to a piece of earth that I can now call home. Not because a deed says it is mine, but because I have poured my sweat into its soil, and my tears into its stone, and my future into its keeping. Home is not a place you inherit. It is not a building someone gives you. It is not four walls and a roof, though those things help when the wind is blowing and the snow is falling and the world outside is dark and cold. Home is a place you create, a place you defend, a place you earn. One shovelful of dirt at a time, one arch raised against the sky, one winter survived, one hand extended by a stranger who decides for reasons of his own that you are worth helping. My grandfather held this ground for decades. He held it alone in silence at a cost that I am only beginning to understand. He held it not for profit, not for pride, but because he believed that some places are worth more than what they can be sold for. He believed that standing your ground is not stubbornness. It is a form of love. I am standing on that ground now. I am standing on his love, and I will hold it, not alone the way he had to, but with the help of people who have taught me that the hardest thing about building a life is not the labor. It is learning to let other people help you carry the weight. This Quonset hut, this half circle of steel pressed against a rock wall, it does not look like much. It is not a mansion. It is not a monument. To some, it probably looks like a scar on the landscape, an eyesore, a metal shed that has no business being here. But to me, it is proof that you can build a home from the most impossible materials in the most impossible places. Proof that inheritance is not about money. It is about the stories we carry and the ground we refuse to give up. It is about choosing the harder right over the easier wrong, even when the easier wrong comes in a cream-colored envelope with a number that could change your life. This structure did not just keep me alive through a cold winter. It taught me who I was, and it gave me a place to become the person I was always meant to be. Silas set the pen down. He closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside his grandfather's, the old leather spines and the new one standing together, a conversation across time between two men who had never met and who understood each other completely. He walked to the window. The valley was dark now, the last light fading from the peaks. The stars were beginning to appear one by one. then in clusters, then in rivers, the vast, cold, beautiful machinery of the universe, turning overhead as it had turned for 1 billion years and would turn for 1 billion more. He reached out and touched the wooden bird on the windowsill. Its feathers were smooth beneath his fingers, worn by years of handling, first by his grandfather's hands, and then by his mother's, and now by his own. 3 generations of touch layered into the grain of the wood like rings in a tree. The bird faced the valley. Its beak was open. It had been singing for a very long time. Silas left it where it was. He added a log to the stove. He closed the damper halfway. He lay down on his bed and pulled the blanket up to his chin and listened to the wind move through the pines outside, that long, low, ancient sound that he had come to love more than any music, more than any voice, more than any sound the human world had ever made. He was home. Outside, the granite wall stood in the darkness, massive and silent, impermanent. It had been here before the town, before the road, before the gate with the name on it. It would be here long after all of it was gone. But tonight, pressed against its face, sheltered by its bulk, warmed by a fire and a purpose, and a legacy that had traveled across decades to find him, there was a small steel structure with a green door and a light in the window. And inside it, a young man who had arrived with nothing and who now had everything that mattered was falling asleep to the sound of the mountain breathing.